Hello, I'm Ronald Day, Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy, and welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal justice system from various perspectives, including from those most impacted by the criminal justice system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewer, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and to share your comments with us on Twitter at The Fortune Society. So today we're going to be discussing a really important issue in our community, and that's the racial disparity in mass incarceration, particularly as it relates to the Latino population. And it's Hispanic Heritage Month, so I think this is an ideal time for us to be talking about these issues. Today we have two dynamic guests with us, Stephen Humble Mangual and Antonio Rivera. So let me introduce you guys to our audience. So Stephen is Latino Affairs Producer for On the Count, the Prison and Criminal Justice Report at WBAI, Public Radio 99.5. He holds a bachelor's degree in social work from Lehman College. He is a member of the National Boricua Human Rights Network, bringing awareness to the issue of Puerto Rican political prisoners and the colonial status of Puerto Rico. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 8 to 24 years in prison and subsequently denied parole 3 times. He's finally released October 6, 2006 after completing 14 years in prison. My understanding is that you've been home almost 10 years now.
Almost 10 years.
That's a wonderful thing. And Antonio, Associate Vice President at the Fortune Society over Alternatives to Incarceration Programs and ATI, in treatment services. So previously, Antonio worked at FiOS for 16 years. There he began as Director of Education and over time was promoted to the Director of Education and Clinical Services. And Mr. Rivera holds a master's degree in sociology and earned a master's degree of social work as well in 2005 from Hunter College of Social Work. So I'm delighted to have both of you guys on both sides of the bars. I know that this is going to be a really profound conversation, considering our conversation beforehand. So again, Hispanic Heritage Month, and there's Latinos that are being impacted by the criminal justice system in a way that has been significantly detrimental. I mean, we talk about mass incarceration, but often we don't talk about it, how it impacts blacks, how it impacts Latinos, and how it impacts other communities. Often we just talk about it generally. And so, I'm interested in how the Latino community has been impacted by harsh criminal justice policies and mass incarceration. And I know, Antonio, we were talking earlier about some of the statistics that relate specifically to Latinos. So why don't, for our audience who might have very limited information about this particular issue, why don't you just, set the context for what's happening with Latinos as it relates to incarceration?
Well, I'd like to say thank you for inviting us. I mean, this is definitely a pleasure. I've been excited about this since last week. I think the issues that impact society as a whole also impacts the Latino community. The broken window policies of NYPD, stop and frisk policies and things like that have targeted Black and Latino communities. So when we speak about mass incarceration, I've always looked at it from a community of color perspective. I think being invited to the show really made me kind of dissect it a little bit more, went deeper into it. And some of the findings that I've seen one is definitely the same social determinants or criminogenics that impact anyone in our community, impact Latinos. And you impact Latinos on a myriad of different issues, a myriad of different ethnicities or ethnic backgrounds, different cultures. It's great when you're a bilingual Latino, but there's many Latinos who are monolingual, so they're intimidated by law enforcement, right? So that kind of makes them even much more, that increases their criminogenics because they're dodging the cops and they don't know how to interact. There's no sense of empowerment. Blacks make up 49% of all state and federal prisoners across the country. Latinos make up 24%. Black men, 1 out of 3 have been involved in the criminal justice system. With Latinos, it's 1 out of 6. For Latinas, it's 1 out of 67, which to me was really an astronomically high number. I would have thought that they would have been profiled a little less. But just prior to the show, we was also speaking about a lot of Latino data doesn't get documented because of a lack of documentation on the person themselves. But we're impacted the same way. Breaking up the Latino families, of course, is what mass incarceration has a tendency to do. A lot of Latinos were in the prison system during the Rockefeller drug laws when that was being enforced upon us. We were represented in the Attica in 1971, and this is the last day of the Attica Rebellion. So I think paying homage to those who passed away and who have been injured in that movement. So we've always been on the forefront. And as you could tell by us, it's two different shades, you know. So when you look at this whole myriad of the rainbow of Latinos, you got from a light skin, very white looking, maybe even possibly red hair, blonde, green eyes, and blonde eyes. And then you got the Afrocentric looking Latino as well from the Afro-Caribbean. And this is who we are. I represent the Puerto Rican community, which I know that we're mud race, right? You know, we have black Spaniards and also Tainos. There's some more indigenous people. Ethnicities, especially when you look at some of our Mexican brothers and sisters who are trying to cross the border for a better life, and how they're being impeded just by immigration laws. And I think this being a presidential election year, we really are looking at how society views Latinos. And I mean, this is the gibberish you hear, or the rhetoric you hear coming from the GOP base. And you and I discussed that all earlier. We're speaking about Latino immigrants. We're not speaking about any other, or they're speaking about Latino immigrants. They're not speaking about any other immigrant community. So we've been impacted just as much. I grew up on plátanos and collard greens, so it's really hard for me to kind of separate myself when I include, you know, when I do speak, I have to think about everything that I'm made up of, and I don't differentiate with that. But for the purpose of Hispanic Heritage Month, it's a great opportunity to kind of highlight what the conditions are. And you could just imagine, I mean, we know what the stats are, we're speaking about it now, so it's half of whatever is being impacted on the African American community, but our experience in prison is totally different.
Got it.
And we could get into that as we speak about the conditions of prison.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that with us. Again, that provided a tremendous amount of context for what's happening generally in the Latino community. And you talked about the diversity. I mean, Latinos are very diverse, just as we talk about in African American community. So that's critical. You brought up an issue that's also key, and that's the overcriminalization of undocumented people. And so, Stephen, I know you have been, you know, looking into this issue pretty deeply. So why don't you share with us, because Latino talked about fractured families, and this is pretty profound when we talk about families being fractured.
Well, currently, as we speak, there are Latino families, really Latina families, and Latino children being held in detention centers across the United States. I mean, right now, many have come over fleeing violence, right? I think the most recent example was a family that is coming from Ecuador, right? And so, I mean, when you think about the criminalization of immigration, it's something that has been happening from day one, right? I mean, we had the Mexican-American War of 1848, and how the Treaty of Guadalupe totally took all of this Mexican land from the Mexicans, right? And so here are a group of people who, you know, were in Mexico, and then based on the war and the treaty, now they're no longer in Mexico, they're in the US. And so now what happened to this group of people? And so throughout history, there's always been this kind of love-hate relationship between immigrants who the United States needs. We're supposed to be a land of immigrants, right? That we need for labor, for cheap labor. And then once they're not needed anymore, sent back, you know, to their countries. And so this has been happening, I mean, for decades and decades. And when we're talking about the criminalization, once upon a time, even going not even that far back, prior to 1990, there were certain acts that weren't considered felonies, that weren't considered you know, enforceable by the criminal justice, the executive arm of the criminal justice system. And so if someone was to be picked up, it wasn't a thing where automatically they would be sent to ICE detention centers. You know, if they weren't committing any crime, you know, if they just happened to be working and they didn't have papers, it was just a matter for immigration. They would just let them go. But then we have subsequent laws that came into effect. And a lot of these Latino families, for the most part, not just Latinos, but, you know, like Antonio mentioned, when you think about immigration, you think about Latinos. And then, of course, you know, we have this presidential election happening right now where these racial epithets, these really negative racial epithets have been thrown towards, you know, Mexican people and also other Latino immigrants. And so, I mean, the the detention centers are full of Latino families, man, that have been broken. Either they're fleeing and seeking asylum, or they've already been here for many, many years. I mean, there's countless studies out of examples where families have been here, children raised, have been here. They just happen not to be, documented. And when we're talking about documented by whom? What does that mean? That means that they were able to go through the process. Either they came with a visa, they didn't extend their stay. They were able to maybe transfer that. You have people who receive other types of documentation through, immigration, like temporary protective service, TPS, or other immigration statuses. Green card is one that a lot of us know about, up until the stage of getting U.S. citizenship. But this is there's so many factors and so many a myriad of different issues when it comes to Latino families and how they're impacted. But we've had a lot of them that are criminalized just based on the fact that they're here. They get picked up because they're working, or they happen to have be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And now, because of post September 11th and the USA Patriot Act, which is one of the most recent, they're being sent back. And then it's being in those detention centers. It's really rough.
Yeah, and I mean, you both mentioned the rhetoric. It's really sad that as much as Latinos impact this community positively, there's so many negative things, and the demonization of that community is really, really sad.
Study after study has proven that Latinos are no more likely to commit crimes in this country, are no more likely to be committing any type of negative. On the contrary, we are contributing to the economy, millions and millions of dollars a year, and they're here for the most part, the overwhelming majority. We're talking about the number that gets thrown out a lot is 11 million, right? 11 million undocumented Latinos. These are people that have been here, have been working, have been raising families, and we're the GOP, which I'm glad you mentioned that, has their own agenda, and it's a sad thing to really see, man. But we definitely need it, and I wanted to thank you for also, and I'm sorry to start with that, for bringing us here and talking about this, because more people need to become aware so we can stand up. I
mean, we need to address these issues in a way that people who are in the audience might not necessarily understand. It's like, because you watch some pundits on television and you think that this is very narrow, the way that it's happened, but you all are showing how broad the implications are for the Latino community.
And it's become politicized. I mean, great that you mentioned, 15 years after the anniversary of 9/11, right? So we're living in a post 9/11 society where there needs to be a boogeyman. Prior to that, you could turn on any TV and the boogeyman was an African-American individual. So now it's either someone of Arab descent or Latino. And that has been perpetuated into other kind of manifestations, such as privatized prisons, these ICE facilities that aren't really governed by a board of correction. So kind of anything we're talking about, substandard medical care, substandard food, and predominantly those that are in there are Mexican immigrants getting ready to be back, deported back. And who cares if you're serving them some potatoes that have worms in it? You know what I'm saying? So I think that's a big thing, is to looking at how in a post 9/11 era, how it almost became okay to fear the Latino immigrant.
And there was discussions recently about the Bureau of Prison deciding not to continue to house people, and at least people who are incarcerated in those federal facilities in these private prisons. But my understanding is that a lot of people who are undocumented are housed in these facilities. And there's also a discussion about whether or not they should stop using them for the same reason that you said a second ago.
But I don't think the feds are controlling that. It's based on the states. So they're allowing the states, so if that's a source of income or cost effectiveness, then they allow the states to do it, because they're not compensating them. They're not making up the difference somewhere else, Yeah,
I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors when it comes to that decision, because whenever you're talking about, I'm glad you made that point, because whenever you're talking about the federal system is a small it's a small portion of when we're talking about the overall carceral state. And it like Antonio says, it is state by state. And the state prisons is where the overwhelming majority of prisoners are, human beings are held, as opposed to the federal system. But I mean, it's a good step forward, but we definitely need to look at these state by state privatized detention centers and how we're going to be dealing with it. Because it shouldn't be, I mean, it's a humanistic thing, right? These are human beings that are placed in these detention centers and are treated how? Are treated unfairly, inhumanely, based on what? Based on their immigration status.
Right.
And when you're talking about privatization, what does that mean? That means profits over people,
Of course.
basically, is what it means. And so you're going to cut all kinds of corners just to make sure that, you know,
Yeah.
you can maximize your profit.
Exactly, and that's why our motto is build people, not prisons.
That's right.
Exactly.
Because when you do that, you show that the emphasis is on making money rather than providing services, because people obviously don't need to be incarcerated in those facilities. I mean, as you mentioned a second ago, people are in the community, they're working, they're contributing to the economy, they're taking care of their families.
Yeah.
So it's, again, it's really, you know,
One of the things I
Unfortunate.
don't want to get lost here is we're speaking about a wide array of Latino ethnicities with
Yeah.
different status
yeah, sure.
in the United States, right? Being Puerto Rican, I was shocked when I heard some of our elected officials say that Obama appointed an immigrant to the Supreme Court, being Sotomayor.
Yeah.
You say, you know, she was naturalized. She's a naturalized American. Yes,
Yeah,
it just wasn't born on the continental U.S. But you have elected officials that are calling her an immigrant.
Yeah.
So I mean, so it's almost it's as if we took Cesar Chavez's sister and put her up there, and you're trying to make this connection. So I think one of the things is that because we're so widespread, I think that people, sometimes society, tends to just kind of paint all Latinos with the same brush. And there's some of us who have an advantage over others, and that's through Operation Bootstraps and the economic development that went into Puerto Rico and some of the other Caribbean countries. You know what I'm saying? Or the Caribbean islands. The next thing on the horizon is definitely Cuba. You know what I'm saying? To see how this system kind of matches ours now that we've opened up trade and tourism with them, because we're going to adapt some of their things and cultures, and they're definitely going to adapt some of ours. But when you see a Latino walking down the block, people are going to say, you're Dominican, you're Cuban, you're Mexican, you're this. And it's hard to differentiate amongst ourselves.
Yeah.
I can understand why, as a Puerto Rican that may be living in California, you're being racially profiled. You're not being racially profiled for gang involvement. You're being racially profiled to see if you're documented or not.
Yeah.
And here you have a Puerto Rican. And we see that. We see a brown skin complexion. It kind of gives anyone the reason, law enforcement reason to stop you.
Yeah, but if you're in a position of power, right? Because that ignorance is fine for someone who may be uneducated, may be young, or age, really doesn't matter regarding age, because ignorance is ignorance doesn't discriminate.
Yeah, it doesn't discriminate.
But I mean, for you to be an elected official in a position of power and to say, we need to deport these Puerto Ricans, when Puerto Ricans have been U.S. citizens since 1917 with the Jones Act, right?
Yeah.
And we've fought in every war since.
Right.
Exactly.
That ignorance is, but it's true that there's this thing where the terms Latino and Hispanic, and I'm using them interchangeably, but there's a reason why these terms are here. We wanted to identify this group because a lot of them, especially during the early, the Black Power movement, and during those eras between the 1940s up till 1970s, they were trying to figure out how do you capture this population which is here.
Right.
First, obviously Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Dominicans, because of the relationship between the United States historically.
countries,
there's been where
That's on the East Coast.
and that's just here, right?
If you're
That's
on the
just
West
here.
Coast,
It
you're
would
dealing
be
with Chicanos,
Right,
That are very
Chicanos who
progressive.
and will maybe not even identify themselves as Latino or Hispanic.
That's right.
Because
Absolutely
the Pew
not.
Research, if you go on, the Pew Research tells you that 51% of the people polled don't consider themselves
Latino.
by any of those
Right.
terms. They define themselves by their ethnic background.
Right.
And we've done it here,
Right.
Puerto Rican,
Exactly.
right?
Right.
That's
And
right.
yet, and this is across the board, the overall majority, 51%, say, I don't have any preference, I'm not. And then I think it's like 33% Hispanic, and then 14% consider themselves Latino. And so, but it's really important that there is no, one group, monolithic group. It is a mixture of many groups. But in this whole struggle of the census count, right? How do we capture and provide needed services to this population when we don't even identify them? And you mentioned something earlier. There's many states with regards to criminal justice data. There's many states that don't collect data regarding the ethnic background of the people that they arrest or the people that they're holding in prisons.
Strictly black and white.
Yeah, and
Black and
let's touch on that issue a little bit more, because there's been an issue of police brutality
Yes.
in Black and Latino communities and other communities of color. but there has been Black Lives Matter that have responded to the police brutality and has tried to, you know, get these issues addressed in a way so that people are held accountable for their actions.
Yes.
And so, you know, we were talking like offline, it was like, there's no Latinos' lives matter.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of Latinos who are victims of police brutality and so forth. So you wanted to, that's something that we wanted to introduce to our audience.
Again, the issue with data.
Yeah.
Who's collecting data regarding Latinos who are being killed by the police in the street?
Yeah.
Very few places are collecting the data. The only place that I could find that's really credible is the Guardian of London. Right?
Wow.
So the Guardian
In
has,
London.
right, the Guardian in London, right?
Yeah.
So it's not a US-based.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the Guardian has this thing called the Counted. And the Counted, so they do research and they try to collect data to try to figure out how many people are killed by the police, the US police, yearly across the United States.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to try to number the Latinos. But for the year of 2015, it was 195 Latino Hispanics that were killed by the police.
Wow.
This year so far, we're up to 129. Now, that number, when you talk about the iceberg effect, right? This is a number that we've been able to identify for some reason, that they are Latinos or Hispanic.
That's what
How
we
many
see.
numbers are undocumented Latinos who are being killed by police? And Antonio made that reference earlier, that they may have gotten killed somewhere on the side of a road somewhere and they don't have identification on them and there's no one to come forward out of whatever reason, out of fear, because the rest of the family is undocumented as well and they don't want to be, you know, sent to immigration. So the number is high, but very rarely, who is it that coined the phrase, the invisibilization of the Latino? From the National Institute Latino, what's the brother's name from the National Institute Latino Policy? Angelo Falcone. Angelo Falcone always talks about the invisibilization, and also Howard Jordan out of Hostos. They always talk about the invisibilization, and this is a clear example of that. The Latinos who are being killed by the police is huge. The number is huge, and yet you hardly ever hear about, one, the data being collected, two, who is reporting on it. And we need to report on it.
Yeah, I'm going on Facebook and I'm seeing, here's a Latino that was killed. Like, where's the outrage?
Yeah.
And
Where
where are the voices that should be raised up to say that this should not be happening in the Latino community?
You know, we always tend to ride on the coattails of the Black community. That's the reality of it. I cringe when I hear that we don't have a Black Lives Matter movement ourselves, and I beg to differ. I have to think back to the 30s and the 40s with Aspida. And it was trying to uplift the Latino immigrants that were coming when we were immigrants to a new land, not as far as immigrant status in that sense. But when we were new arrivals, there was definitely Aspida, there was Hispanic AIDS Forum, there was Promesa. There was many programs that came that tried to uplift us economically, better housing, school. We know the Young Lords definitely took after the Black Panthers with the free lunch programs and free breakfast programs, after school programs. So we've always been a few minutes late to the party, but we're definitely there. An interesting thing as well is, you know, when we look at the police brutality, you have a lot of Latinos, Boricuas, that have very American-sounding last names. For people familiar with the Yankees, Bernie Williams. Right? No one would have thought Bernard Williams was this Puerto Rican hero from Puerto Rico. You know what I'm saying? But so was Michael Stewart. You know what I'm saying? And he came from a Latino family. So when that was reported, I doubt very seriously that it was reported in the Latino column. And based on the media, you know, mainstream media said, oh, Stewart, it didn't end in a vowel. So it got to be African American and based on the complexion. So again, I have to say, admittedly, that, you know, our movement is a lot quieter. We're being drowned out. It took me a long time to realize with the Black Lives movement, recognizable movement that I wanted to support until I started going to some national conferences. And I seen how audacious they were, which is a great thing. I'm saying that in a very positive light. They were interrupting the Health and Human Secretary, Health and Human Service Secretary. They came and kind of right in front of her spoke about the HIV epidemic in Puerto Rico. USA. So we're very outspoken with certain things. And you're right, there's something about challenging law enforcement. I mean, not for a Puerto Rican, but I'm thinking that somebody with an undocumented status is not going to rally. We seen that maybe when we were talking about the path to citizenship and everybody congregated across the country from Times Square to LA to Atlanta to DC. And we came out, I think we were something like 6 million strong.
Yeah.
You say, so it depends when our backs are against the wall,
Yeah,
we really do
exactly.
come up. But a lot of us ride with the black movements
Yeah.
because
That's
this is who we are. We
That's
don't
right.
make that separation. So mainstream media separates us. It's the
Yeah.
divide and conquer, but we're a community of color.
That's right.
So there's always power in numbers. So yes, you're right. It's not the Latino Lives Matter movement, but there are Latinos who are part of that and embedded
Yeah.
into that and working towards that,
Got
you
it.
know?
And we have just a couple of minutes left. And the thing that we generally like to do as we end the show is talk about recommendations. So I'd like to hear, what recommendations do you suggest to help improve the conditions in Latino communities?
Well, I think one thing we have to do is pick and choose our battle, right? And pick and
Okay.
choose our fight, because there's so many aspects of this whole thing about the injustices within the Latino community. When we're talking about decriminalizing, drug use, and so
Yes.
that's one recommendation what we should have. And we've come a long way when it
Sure.
comes to that. I mean, I remember the Drop the Rock movement. So that's one aspect when it comes to decriminalization of drug use. But then when we talk about things like stop and frisk and broken windows, we definitely need to, as a community, come together, the Black and Latino community together, because we're talking about 50 million and 54 million, 104 million people.
right.
There should be no reason why the community shouldn't be empowered enough to be able to do away with some of those type of policies.
Thank you. And we have a minute left.
Yeah,
or
I like
so.
to go a little deeper, and I say that prison services, because we are going to go to jail. I mean, this is the way the system is set up for us, right? You know, more Latino-based programming within the facilities, as well as re-entry programs that are kind of tailored for the Latino communities, right? You know, even in our ATI program, I have one Latino.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one is that they're not utilizing services because of this kind of sense of it's not appropriate for me. So the cultural and linguistic appropriateness of our programming. Again, the whole deal about of one enforcer is instead of trying to mop up the water, just shut off the sink. You know what I'm saying? And that's what we need to do.
Thank you. And I would say also a path to citizenship for those
Without a
who are
doubt.
Right.
undocumented. So thank you, Antonio, for being here. Stephen, we appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks to our guests, Stephen Humble Manuel and Antonio Rivera, for joining us on both sides of the bars today. And thank you in TV Land for joining us as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Ronald Day as we critically look at both sides of the bars.